I have my timer here because I am a notorious talker. And when I talk about something, a subject that I love, I get so involved that I forget about time and space. You know, these topics are hard topics, but they're so important. It's so important that we be sympathetic, knowledgeable people. It's important that we have enough courage to feel bad about things that happened in the past. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that tells us that we're human beings and we care about one another. And we care about what has impacted one another, especially when they're hard, they're painful, they've created harm, sometimes irreparable harm. And so this particular topic, the politics of inequality, it's a hard topic, but it is one that I personally have lived with all of my life. I grew up in Villa Heights in Norfolk. One street over from where my home was one of the 4 city dumps that Norfolk decided to put in my neighborhood and in the neighborhood adjoining me, Lindenwood. No other group of people in Norfolk had to endure that. I cannot imagine the impact that it had on my health. I do know I'm allergic to everything under the sun. And I can't believe that came about naturally. It comes about because of environmental influences. When decision makers decide who matters and who doesn't matter, that's when we all can suffer. Because at some point in time, one decision maker that may not care about you may be making decisions about your life. And so, remembering, understanding, talking about, documenting this history, making sure that our children know this history, making sure that it is printed, it is public, it is out there, that it's not hidden. Because when you hide things, they have a tendency to repeat themselves. But when they're out in the open and they're acknowledged, you have a chance to escape the perilous impact that repetition could have. In so many ways, the politics involved in the redevelopment of cities is inextricably tangled in the politics of inequality. In 1967, the work of Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority in rebuilding, for example, the Berkeley section of Norfolk, to eliminate blighted areas there, blighted areas around what was Norfolk State College, which is now Norfolk State University, eliminating the blighted areas around the older Booker T. Washington High School, which is now slightly moved, but pretty much in the same area. It helped to raise the profile of Norfolk internationally. And as a result, there were 26 leaders from developing countries that came to Norfolk to learn what they did to help these poor, low-income people and to clear out the slums. In fact, in the newspaper from Gary, Indiana, the Post-Tribune, it said Norfolk was a shining example of how a disreputable city can be transformed into a community in which its residents can take pride. Well, you know, I would have had a problem with a newspaper calling Norfolk a disreputable city in 1967. I remember 1967, I'm that old, and I would not have considered Norfolk disreputable. But for African American residents who lived in these neighborhoods that were destroyed, who were part of the blight, urban renewal meant relocation, in most cases permanent relocation, moving from where their families owned homes, moving from friends and family and other relatives. And not being able in 1967 to purchase a property of similar value. I remember when I grew up, as I said, in Villa Heights, my father in 1969 was looking for a home. He couldn't find a waterfront property in Norfolk, except in one little area in Winona, because people didn't want to sell to an African American, regardless of how much money they had, because money, unfortunately, even today, is not green in people's minds. It has a color of black or white. And so many of these people saw what the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority did, not as urban renewal, but as Negro removal. And that's what they called it. Because thousands of black families, most of them part of the working poor, we have this mentality that poor people don't work. But in America, poor people work harder than anybody else. Often 2 and 3 and 4 jobs at a time, working almost around the clock. And so many of these working poor were removed. And so they went from, in some cases, a home that was passed down to them generationally to renting property, depriving them of their wealth. And the money that Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority gave was not much. It was certainly not enough to purchase a new home. They were promised that homes would be rebuilt. Remember East Ghent? All the promises about rebuilding the homes in East Ghent with affordable housing. They just forgot to say who can afford that housing. The majority of the people who did live in East Ghent, who were part of the working poor, could never afford to live in the reinvented East Ghent. And there was no intention on the part of city officials to let them move back in there. Because Norfolk, as well as many of the other cities throughout the country, have a bait and switch. They have the plan that they show you, that they show the residents, and then the plan they actually implement. And unfortunately, we've recently seen another example of that with the military circle development. I forgot to warn you, I do get in trouble a lot. I have a mouth, and I'm not afraid to use it. And at this point in my life, you know, when I had to actually get Medicare, at that point in my life, it's like, okay, what is there really to lose? Well, you know, since the 20th century, America has really been grappling with this ugly past. Those in denial about these truths, and they dismiss them as anomalies, claiming that instructing people about this past, talking about it, causes you to hate your nation. And I find that when it comes to African Americans, no other group of people seems to love this country more than African Americans. If you can imagine, you've been beaten, your children have been taken from you, killed, maimed, harmed, you've been discriminated against, you've been marginalized, and you still sign up to fight for this country. You still pledge allegiance to the flag. You still talk about, I love America, home of the free and the brave. You still do that. You still love America when America doesn't love you. They want you to go back to Africa. I told one of my classmates when I was in junior high school, when he said, you know, you all need to go back, I said, you first. I've always been this way. I will admit that. And I say that because we act as if we don't know who we are. We act as if, and as long as we can not see that mirror, we see a painting. We're like officer, and I forgot his name. The character who had this painting and then he did evil, and the painting took all the evil. Dorian Gray, thank you. So we're like Dorian Gray. We have a portrait somewhere that we hide in the back room where all of our evils come up on that portrait. And we come out looking nice and clean and young and not filled with pockmarks and so forth. But it's important to look at that ugliness because it's a reminder of what not to do again. That's why when you're trying to teach a child not to do something wrong, you don't just pass it over. You try to remind them, teach them the lesson so that they would learn the lesson, and that would keep them from doing or repeating a mistake. But we don't do that in America, and as a result, we repeat these mistakes over and over and over again. We deny our past. We blame people for talking about the past. And we say that if you talk about it, you hate America. Well, tonight's discussion, obviously, I'm going to dive into all of these hard facts. I'm going to use examples from the city of Norfolk. And I thought about using a whole bunch of different examples, but there's so much in Norfolk. I said, I'm just going to stay right there in Norfolk for just a minute. But I do want to remind you, since we're in Virginia Beach, you all know that Virginia Beach, when it was a town, was a sundown town. You all know that, right? And that meant that black people were not allowed to even walk in Virginia Beach unless they had a pass. Unless they were fingerprinted and photographed and carried that pass with them at all times. That was Virginia Beach. When I grew up in this area, I did not go to the ocean front until college because I knew I was not welcome. And so Virginia Beach has a long legacy. And there's a conflation sometimes with the town of Virginia Beach and Princess Anne County and the parts of Norfolk County that it also absorbed. There is a difference. Because in Princess Anne County, that's where you had African Americans right after the Civil War who purchased property and created communities for themselves that later on Virginia Beach stole away. That's another story. So everybody has, there are no innocent people, no innocent municipalities in Virginia or in this country. And hopefully the research that Johnny and others are doing help you to understand you're not alone. You're not alone with the problem, but you're also not alone with the potential solutions. And so I'm going to just throw out at the end, not so much solutions, but pathways. Pathways, hopefully, to a difference in how we look at things and maybe fixing things. Numerous scholars have said that this residential inequity is really at the heart of America's inequity. Because where you live influences where you go to school. It influences your health. It influences your perspective of the world. It influences whether or not you imagine yourself to be successful. You imagine yourself beyond just that small little neighborhood. I'm always amazed when I encounter people who live in Norfolk who've never come to Norfolk State. It's like, what have you been doing all of your life? Oh my God, so when you pass by that section on the highway, what do you have, these blinders like horses? You don't see anything on the side? They don't come to Norfolk State because they believe they'll be killed. I was at a Starbucks when there was one located right across from the Marriott on Main Street in Norfolk, and this woman came in and she asked the barista, is it safe to walk on the street? Because she was from Virginia Beach. And he looked at her confused. And he said, yeah. She said, because there's shadows and shades and whatnot. He was like, yeah. So I waited until she left. I said, you should have told her, no, run for your life. You will be killed. Instead of, you know, people convince themselves to be afraid based on nothing but what they've been taught, the mythologies that they've been taught. This is an example of how even today, when people of color move into neighborhoods that are predominantly white, fear takes the heart of many people, and they start finding a way to leave because they think their property values are going to go down. They think that the neighborhood is going to be drug infested. All kinds of negative stereotypes come to their minds because of how they've been socialized and indoctrinated. And the sad thing is that some people will never change. But the good news is some people will. And that's the hope that we hold on to. You know, more Americans believe that residential segregation always existed in America. And it didn't. Residential segregation, and I was actually surprised when I was working on my dissertation, I was looking through the records in Norfolk, and in the 1880s and 1890s, there were black and white people who were living in the same house. They were renting apartments in the same building, living side by side with each other. So I had thought that was the usual, but it wasn't. In most of the South, there was no segregation per se. Now, certainly, you had areas that poor people lived in and were marginalized in. You had areas in which only the white elite lived because of the value of the homes and the refusal by some of those individuals not to sell to other people. But in the middle classes and in the lower classes, there was very little difference in where people lived. But they did tend to congregate together in communities that were supportive. And you would see the birth of churches and other types of institutions that reflected that environment of community. You would see that with the small Jewish community in Norfolk that would begin to grow and expand. And so that was not unusual, but it wasn't by law. It was by choice in most cases. Here are some images of downtown Norfolk in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And you can see Norfolk was a nasty little place to be because it was a port. And you had merchants who ran Norfolk. And all they thought about was what money they were getting at that moment. They were not thinking of investing in the infrastructure. And by the way, that was true of most of the country. You see pictures of New York, the same era, it looked just as nasty, just as filthy, just as dirty. You can go to Boston, Philadelphia, they all look the same. So, you know, if we actually went back in time, you would probably pass out because the stench would knock you out. Because people didn't bathe, there was no such thing as deodorant, and there were open sewers, and people threw the contents of their chamber pots out the front door or out the window. And hopefully it didn't land on you if you were walking by the house. So the past was just very filthy and dirty. But most people thought that we lived in segregated communities. Now, as northern states began to eliminate slavery, that's when you started to see the emergence of segregation in the north. And you would see in some cases a neighborhood with a street that was supposed to be only black people living on that street. And then the next street over, only white people were supposed to be living on that street. So you saw that kind of weird tapestry of where people were living. But that took, even in the North, that took a little while to really manifest itself. It wasn't until the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries did we see segregation, residential segregation, emerge in this Commonwealth and in the South in general. Most of the people, as I said, they divided themselves by socioeconomic level, not so much by race. During the early 1920s, we would see in the Church Street area, and you see the different wards. It was the 4th ward that many African Americans lived. The majority of African Americans were concentrated in that ward. That's where all of your major black churches, the historic First Baptist Church, what became St. John's, AME Church. You had St. Philip's Catholic Church in that area. You had First Calvary. These were all the major black churches, and these, the 4th ward is where you had mixed income. You had those who were wealthier, those who were working poor, all living in that community. And it was in the 1920s that the city began to harm African Americans even more. Not just, okay, you're going to stay in this little corner of Norfolk, even though they made up over almost half the population, and they could pretty much only stay in 2 wards out of 6. But they also limited public transportation. The city passed a law saying jitney drivers, and these were, little miniature cab, but somebody was actually walking with it and taking you places. They banned those. There were no streetcars going down Church Street where black people lived in the 4th ward. And so they were trying to marginalize the transportation efforts of African Americans as well. And then the city's business districts were divided into 2 areas. You had Granby Street, that was for white businesses, Church Street for black businesses. All of this was done in the early part of the 20th century. Between 1921 and 1923, Norfolk annexed a lot of surrounding boroughs that were part of Norfolk County. Now, this is still before Virginia said that all counties and cities had to be incorporated. So you had a city within a county. You don't have that anymore. And so they were annexing places like Bramilton, Lambert's Point, and other areas. Areas that we, of course, see as part of the city of Norfolk. They were actually outside the boundaries. At the end of the Civil War, by the way, Norfolk was 4 square miles. So the boundary of Norfolk was Bramilton Avenue. That's how tiny the city was. Portsmouth was only 2 square miles. So everything outside was considered a suburb. And they were starting then to annex these suburbs. When they did the light rail in Norfolk, if you've ever kind of wondered, why is it that all those tracks intertwine all throughout the city and all these different areas? It's because they used the same tracks that they used in the 19-teens. And when I say tracks, the same patterns of where white people were living, not where black people were living, because those tracks did not go anywhere that black people were living. Sounds a little familiar today. Okay. So P.B. Young, who's a publisher of the Journaling Guide, he complained about what was going on in Norfolk in the 1920s. He wanted these same amenities for African Americans that were being provided to the white population, But he said, essentially, that unless they pushed, it wouldn't happen. So he started this campaign, Own Your Own Home campaign. And there was a bank called Brown Savings Bank, and Brown was someone who was originally from Philadelphia. He was brought to Newport News by Huntington to help set up a bank or some sort of financial institution for the blacks who worked at the Newport News shipyard. And then he eventually moved to Norfolk, set up a bank, became very prosperous. He had a Christmas fund, so that rather than you getting in debt at Christmas time, you would give a little money every week, and by the time Christmas came around, you had all kinds of money so that you didn't get into debt. And he moved that to a mortgage fund. And this resulted in a number of African Americans having enough money saved up for a mortgage. He was so successful that most of the white banks copied what he did to help the white community. And so Young was pushing for not only blacks to save money, but for blacks to start more banks. And we would begin to see these investment institutions emerging in this time period. But you had a problem. There were a handful of black real estate and black realtors, but most of them were white. And they looked at what was going on and decided, oh yeah, let's take advantage of this. So they would sell a property in a white neighborhood to a black person, and then all the white people would get frightened and be willing to sell at a low cost, and then they would, of course, have that home sold to black homeowners. And of course, the city then would stop providing the resources and amenities to that neighborhood as it turned from white to black. And so those were some of the problems going on in the early part of the 1920s. Well, African Americans said enough of all of that. We want better homes. And so one of the communities that they set their sights on was Brambleton. It was a big farm. And it was owned by George Bramble, and it first got developed in 1889. And this big farm is where Norfolk State University is located today. This is where also Norfolk Community Hospital used to be located. This is where the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA was located. This is where all of your African American middle and upper middle classes moved into eventually, but it was not without a fight. They saw this community, they said, this has all the amenities, it's for middle class people, and we can move in there. Rather than us spending money, developing our homes, but not having our streets paved, not having electricity and water and sewage brought into our neighborhoods, not having all of these amenities, not being on a streetcar. Rather than go through that, we're going to move into this neighborhood. And then the fight began. Norfolk City Council drew up a law basically saying we're not having this. They passed an ordinance designed to force black residents out of the area. But you know, black people had lawyers. You all know this, right? Who were black lawyers back then. And the NAACP had a branch in Norfolk, and they started filing lawsuits because in 1917, there was a Supreme Court case called Buchanan versus Worley that said that a city, state, county cannot discriminate in selling property. So a city, state, county cannot, based on race, cannot say, you're a black person, you can't purchase property here. And so they forced the city's hand in that regard, but then the city decided it was going to do something else. It was going to still do what they wanted to do and say, well, we have a dividing line. It's called Corprew Avenue. And at that Corprew Avenue, this is where the whites are living on this side and the blacks can live on the other side. That's our divide. So we'll relent only there. this made African Americans mad. City officials said then, because it applied to everybody, it wasn't a violation of the Supreme Court decision. Of course it was. But they let it sit for a short while. But then in 1925, the city passed an ordinance, and it wanted to push blacks back even further. And one minister, his name was the Reverend Richard Bowling Jr. He was the pastor of the historic First Baptist Church. He wrote regular articles in the Journal and Guide. But, you've heard the thing, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. That was Richard Bowling. And this is a little excerpt from the article that was published. He had been talking about how lying, bootlegging, gambling, stealing, immorality, financial crookedness, dancing, muddy madness, lack of home training, treacherous leadership, card playing, and non-support of the church were some of the biggest sins. But he said the worst sin of all was the sin of segregation. He said especially residential segregation, because it had, quote, a bone-crushing impact on the souls of black people that appeared insurmountable. So determined was Bowling that this issue become part of a public discussion that he put this out and kept putting it out and put it out some more. He continued to rail against this issue. He said that this law, this ordinance, contradicted the American dream. He said we may be injured in our privileges and immunities, but segregating our living and Jim Crowing our travels personally insulted people in their homes. And he said we are not going to accept it. He said white city officials clearly would rather see Norfolk remain a medieval town than to change its policies. He believed that trying to negotiate with city officials was useless. They would promise everything and give nothing. So he urged African Americans to resist, to fight back, not only in the courts, but with their feet, to just go ahead and move into that neighborhood, and move in they did. And what's interesting is the city council met and then ruled that they were going to purchase all of the property from the black people who had purchased property in Bramilton. But they never did, because it would have cost too much, and the white people were starting to move out anyway. What's interesting, and this is part of the history that you don't know about, is during that time, there was a Negro Chamber of Commerce. There was also, as I mentioned, the Brown Savings Bank, the Tidewater Bank and Trust, the Metropolitan Bank and Trust, the Norfolk Home Building and Loan Association, a branch of the Richmond Beneficial Insurance Company, a branch of the Virginia Beneficial Insurance Company, the People's Mutual Burial and Beneficial Association, the Berkeley Citizens Mutual Building and Loan Association, as well as one that developed where I grew up, the Villa Heights or Villa Park Association. This picture shows you they were located primarily in and around Church Street. This is the bank, the Metropolitan Bank and Trust, owned by African Americans. The only reason it did not survive the Great Depression is not because it didn't have the funds, but because Virginia refused to give it a certificate to continue to function as a bank. So in this latter period, we had so many African Americans who were still concentrated in Church Street, but they were pushing the boundaries of Norfolk. In fact, Villa Heights was marketed as the Negro Ghent of Norfolk. It had tree-lined streets. It had 6-room houses. It was located, it had direct access to streetcar lines, especially for those who didn't own cars. But the problem was, once again, it did not have the city investing in the infrastructure. And of all the places for there to be city dumps located, they put 2 right there, was inside and right beside that neighborhood. Not only to harm the assessed value of those of the homes there, but also who would want to live next to a city dump with all the rats and roaches and other kinds of things that come from living in that area. And so they were constantly harmed by that. You know, the Church Street area had pharmacies, jewelry stores. It had a theater that was developed by blacks. The architect was black. The funders were black. They brought in all kinds of black entertainers, some of the top entertainers in the country, as well as scholars like W.B. Du Bois. They all brought them to the Addicts Theater. There were at least 3 different black-owned hotels in Norfolk, which made Norfolk unusual because most of the cities in the South didn't have any hotels. But Norfolk, at one point, had 3. And so if you have a copy of the Green Book, depending on the date, you might actually see 1 or 2 of them listed in there. And so little Norfolk had a lot going on. But the problem, once again, and I'm going to continue to say that, the problem was the infrastructure that was not invested, even though they paid taxes. In fact, Richard Rothstein, who wrote the book, The Color of Law, talked about how Norfolk continues, even today, to assess the property values of black property at a higher rate than what they could sell it for. So they're still taxing blacks at a higher rate. And that reminds me of these gas stations. You go into a black neighborhood, the gas is always higher. You go a mile away and it's 20 cents lower. How is that? It's the same city. So what is going on with that? So you still have all of those kinds of issues taking place. This is the Addicts Theater in 1919, and thank God that some of our leaders, like the Reverend Green, who just passed away, had a vision to make sure that that one building was not destroyed. Because most of the buildings that African Americans constructed have been destroyed. Not only in Norfolk, but in Hampton, in Portsmouth, in Newport News, in Williamsburg, and the list just goes on. Name a city. And so it's good that that's there, and the original curtain with Crispus Attucks is there. The man who was considered to be the first person to die in the American Revolution. Of course, by the time we get into the 1930s, and this is where the exhibit is so important here, you see redlining. And of course, redlining is during the New Deal, and actually even before the New Deal, under Herbert Hoover. He created in 1932 the Federal Home Loan Bank. And then when Roosevelt came into office, he created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is an expansion of that laid the foundation for federal investment in home ownership, but it was to be for whites only. They were not going to extend that money to blacks. In fact, You know, there was no credit rating at the time, so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, was the one who would decide who was a risky investment and who wasn't. And when you look at the indices, you see clearly that the primary indicator of whether it was a risky investment is whether it was located in a predominantly black neighborhood. And because of that, people couldn't get money to renovate their homes. They couldn't get money to renovate the landscape of their area. They couldn't get money. And so either you sold your home for a loss and couldn't really buy anything else, or you stayed there. And this would continue. One of the most important studies then was this book by Rothstein, because he really, in 2017, he really pulled out a lot of information about housing discrimination. It wasn't just a result of private or municipal actions, but rather the federal government played a direct role. They were encouraging people, just like the Homestead Act of 1862, that encouraged people to go west. And after a period of time, they would acquire that land. These acts were designed to do the same thing. The problem is, it didn't apply to African Americans. The GI Bill, there were a few black people who were able to secure the GI Bill, but most of them could not. It only was designed for white men. And so we talk about this past as if it was accessible to everybody, but the reality is they had restrictions. In fact, by the time we got to the 1949 Housing Act, it specifically created a fund to help realtors construct suburban living. But it said if the money or if the development was to accommodate African Americans, you could not get any money. So African American realtors who were developing properties for their community had to do it on their own. They could not access federal funds to support what they were doing. And people lost land. W.T. Mason, Sr., owned all that land on Virginia Beach Boulevard that's now part of the industrial park in Norfolk, all the way to the creek. He owned all that land, and he planned right next to Ingleside, and he planned on developing all of that property, but the city of Norfolk said, it's too close to the white people. That means the black children and the white children will go to school together. This was in the 1950s. So you're going to either sell the land or we're going to condemn it and take it from you. One or the other. One or the other. So these are the kinds of things that have happened over the years. Another example is Atlantic City. You know where Centera, Norfolk General is located, that whole medical complex? That was part of Atlantic City. When I first saw the name, I thought they were talking about someplace up in New Jersey. I realized they were talking about this little neighborhood called Atlantic City. But this is where blacks and whites lived almost next to each other. It would have been the first place that would have integrated schools in Norfolk. But Norfolk officials were not having it. And they tore it down. They completely razed that entire area. Paul Riddick was a resident at the time, growing up in Atlantic City. And he saw his house destroyed, his neighborhood destroyed, because of the policies of Norfolk. And then, of course, gave it to a private company to create a community that was not a living community at the time. It was just for industry or for medical purposes. One last area I want to talk about, and in part because is still in the news. Tidewater Gardens is part of the St. Paul's corridor that's been completely destroyed. And you know, I'm calling these areas neighborhoods. But if you notice, we use a very interesting language. We call public housing, housing. We don't call them neighborhoods. We call it housing. People live there generationally. They know who their neighbors are. They know who lives next door. And yet we're calling it housing, which you may not think semantically is that different, but it does mean something when it's your community, when it's your neighborhood. And so words really mean something. And I want to caution us, whenever you hear someone refer to a public housing area as housing instead of this neighborhood, they're sending a message that maybe they don't realize they're sending as to the value that they give to the people who live in those neighborhoods. Well, Tidewater Gardens was a place of absolute neglect, and I'm just going to show you a few pictures. Flooding, unpaved streets, streets that were once in a blue moon may have been paved but hadn't been looked at, no trash collection, things discarded, houses falling apart. By the way, at that time, the majority of people who owned slum housing served on the city council. Some of the housing did not have, they had an earthen floor. They didn't even have a wooden floor. And this was in the 1950s. The Women's Interracial Council, the black women in that council took the white and Jewish women to see those houses, to see how people were really living. And many cried because they had no idea that this existed in Norfolk in the 1950s. People were living as if they were back in the 1800s. Now, this picture was taken right after the construction in 1956 of this new park. Now they were, I don't know if they were using the word park ironically, because yes, they put some nice little plants around, but they had the fencing and you see the swings. That's not what I call a park. They had a few trees, but it lacked a lot of tree canopy, which meant that it was hot as hell in the summer. And of course, this map, and I have to give also kudos to the Urban Renewal Center for the work that they have been doing, looking at the threats to a lot of communities. And they talk about the social vulnerability. And the social vulnerability in those areas, we're talking about the negative effects of communities from external stresses on your human body, on your psychological well-being. So some of these stresses are enhanced by poverty, lack of access to transportation and medical facilities, crowded housing, minimal police presence, proliferation of firearms, failing schools, drugs, environmental challenges, whether it's active or passive, such as proximity to city dumps, heavy industries, landfills, toxic waste sites that have not been addressed. Together, these factors weaken a community's ability to prevent human suffering, financial loss, and discouragement. And so we see Tidewater Gardens, Calvert Square, Young Terrace. Those are the three communities that have public housing that have the highest social vulnerability rating. In fact, Tidewater Gardens is also one of the most, is one of the most threatened areas in the entire city in terms of flooding and seawater rising. And so those areas in particular are really problems. So how do we erase the implementation of a public housing system that localized African Americans to certain areas, the poorest of the people to the center of town so everybody can see them and see what they don't have, see the limitations of access to healthy food, living, amenities, public transportation, high-achieving schools. For decades, blacks were actually steered to public housing while whites were steered to public vouchers. Richard Rothstein talked about how these kinds of stresses have a tremendous impact, not only on the well-being, the psychological well-being of people, but also the reputation of the city, the way that people see that city, and whether it's considered a livable city or not. Now, some have said, how do we change this institutionalized behavior? Because people don't understand when we talk about racism, that's an institution. It's been baked into a system. So you don't have to personally be a racist, but if you do what other people have done and you just continue that system, you're perpetuating a racist system. It doesn't have anything to do with you personally. It just has to do with you are changing a system that is harmful to other people. And so how do you do that? Especially when you have a lot of patronage. I complain all the time about VDOT. I call it Bubba and his brothers. They come up with all kinds of crazy ideas about what they should do. Like a few years ago when they decided to shut down both of the tunnels and to limit Route 17 to one lane. Literally one lane, not one lane on each side. One lane, all on the same weekend. That was Bubba and his brothers. Some people have said reparations. Now, I don't know, that seems to scare a lot of white people half to death when you say reparations, and I have no idea why. When people have been overassessed in their taxes, they're owed money back because they've had money stolen from them. When they've had property condemned because the city wanted that property, they should be compensated for that. But the problem with reparations is some people see that as a one and done. That means that there are no simple solutions to these issues. You can't just build a medical clinic in a neighborhood without amenities and say, well, we're done. You can't do that. What about the money of maintaining and renovating and expanding? It's a one and done. And so there has to be ongoing support. Well, Thomas Shapiro outlined in his book, The Hidden Costs of Being African American, how wealth perpetuates inequality. He argued that there needs to be a different approach to remedying the racial wealth gap. It's important as we move then into the 21st century that we as Americans see that if we do not collectively advocate for remedies and changes to the system, systemic changes to a system, not just replacing one body with the other, because it's not enough to put a woman, regardless of her racial or ethnic affiliation, or a black person in the position, and you haven't changed the system.
That's right.
You are not doing anything other than perpetrating a fraud. And so, I told you I was going to get in trouble. So we have to collectively remedy these problems by coming up with real solutions about how we change practices. Using these studies, using these maps, using the recommendations of scholars who've studied this to come up with solutions, and penalizing, and I don't mean a slap on the wrist, penalty, penalizing those who violate these remedies with real action that will hurt. Like you can no longer do business here for another 10 years. Those kinds of real changes must happen. Because, as I have in this quote, if not now, when? If not me, who? If we don't decide enough is enough, that we live in a community of people, and if we all don't move forward, we all will stay behind. Thank you so much.